Hello class, today we're going to be discussing tomorrow's lesson and just giving some insight into what we're going to be talking about in class, just so y'all can come to class prepared and be expecting, and can also do some background research into what to expect in terms of like the stuff we're going to cover. So of course, going over each state standard, we're going over this lesson standard is US 64. We're going to be explaining the fears of Americans surrounding the nuclear holocaust, debates over stockpiling and the use of nuclear weapons, including atomic testing, the launch of Sputnik and the impact of the launch of Sputnik, civil defense in terms of America and other nations. We're going to be talking about MAD, which is the term mutually assured destruction, and what that means, as well as talking about fallout shelters and some more popular ones that were built in this time period. Of course, in this time period, post-World War II, towards the end of the war, you had the introduction of the first atomic weapons that were used on Japan, and all the background info that went into that. And then as time progresses, as we go deeper into the Cold War, the Soviet Union begins, developing and testing their own nuclear weapons. So the fear of like a nuclear war always breaking out was always present in the minds, and it kind of built like an arms race between the two superpowers at the time, which, as we know, is the United States of America and the USSR, aka the Soviet Union. So in tomorrow's lesson, we're going to be going over the fear of nuclear weapons and what brought with it. Part of that is MAD, which is mutually assured destruction. That is basically the concept where both sides, in the event of a nuclear war, both sides were almost against it, but because if a nuclear war broke out, that would mean both sides were assured that it'd be mutually assured destruction on both sides. It'd be the end of humanity as we know it. So in a way, it was kind of a deterrent for the use of nuclear weapons for both nations. We're going to be discussing cases of accidental launches. Times where one nation thought the other nation had launched preemptively, and kind of a panic breaks out because you have that window of time where are we going to get hit by a nuclear weapon? Is this real? How should we respond to this? That type of thing. We're going to be discussing nuclear testing, some famous sites in America, such as like the Alamo site, or the first Trinity test, which was the first nuclear bomb, that test site. Some in the Pacific Islands, such as like Bikini Atoll, where like famous nuclear weapons were dropped, and some test sites in Europe and other places. And we're also going to be discussing the cultural impact of the time. The Cold War was a very influential thing on all society. The nuclear family was brought out into existence. You saw advancements in technology in this time period, post-World War II. You saw the rebuilding of Europe and different cultures that spawned from that. It was this time period was very, I don't know the term, I guess it was very, shaky. It's very, this time period was very, back and forth, and like society as a whole changed because of what happened in World War II. We're also going to be discussing and watching some videos on the first Trinity test. It was the first test of a nuclear bomb or atomic bomb in history. The Manhattan Project was the first project from the USA side of developing a nuclear weapon. It was headed by Robert J. Oppenheimer, and the Trinity test really set in motion today's world as we know it, because the threat of nuclear war breaking out is always a very strong possibility. We're going to be discussing widespread testing internationally, and then we're gonna look over a map. It's an interactive map where you can actually put in our location, which is Martin, Tennessee. We can actually see what the closest nuclear test was to us. When the last test was conducted, were you alive for it? And we're going to be discussing in class openly, is nuclear testing ethically moral due to things like radioactive fallout and such. We're going to cover Sputnik a lot. Sputnik was the first man-made object ever launched into space. It was launched by the Soviet Union. It really marked the beginning of the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Of course, that led to like significant advances in technology and exploration. It basically became we use the term arms race for nuclear weapons. It became known as the space race because, each, the USA and USSR were the two, global superpowers at the time, and they're both at a race against each other to, can we be the first country to orbit human? Can we have the most satellites in the air, in the space? Can we get to the moon first? It became a very big deal. We're going to talk about the education and research side of it back home. You saw huge programs like STEM being launched, of course NASA, and the National Defense Education Act, which came into play. Very important pieces of education and research were pushed forward, and also pieces of legislature that are very important. We're going to again go over the impact of Sputnik and satellites as a whole, what led to like global communication such as satellites, GPS, things like that. And while talking about Sputnik, we'll talk about the increase of tensions it led to between the United States and the USSR. The next thing we'll cover is civil defense, different pieces of legislation and organizations that were created in terms of civil defense of us back home. The FCDA, which is the Federal Civil Defense Administration, was established in 1950, and it was responsible for preparing the American public in case of a nuclear attack. They use things like public education campaigns, similar to how we would do fire drills or tornado drills or earthquake drills at school. They had nuclear test drills, and of course, again, talking about the construction of fallout shelters. And again, all these things we're going to be covering involving this era and this time period. We're going to be talking about the impact it had on us as a society more than anything. And the last thing we'll hit on will be fallout shelters. Fallout shelters were designed structures that were intended to protect occupants from radioactive debris or fallout. They can vary in complexity. They can be very simple little 4x4 holes in the ground, or they could be reinforced basements that could allow you to live for weeks at a time down there. The most important things were, of course, shielding from radiation. Radioactive fallout was a very important thing to be wary of in this time period. It had to include air filtration, supplies, and it had to be self-sufficient. You had to live in these fallout shelters for weeks at a time because, again, like we talked about in MAD, when nuclear war breaks out, that's the uprooting of society as a whole. Like everything shuts out. You can't just go to the grocery store and go to Walmart and get milk and eggs whenever you need it. You can't go get gas. Like, you are essentially shut off from the rest of the outside world if an attack like this ever happened. We'll also be discovering the important leaders of this time period. Cold War really doesn't officially start until around 1947, when you had things like the Berlin airlifts going on and Berlin being divided between the Allied forces minus the USSR, who controlled West Berlin. We'll also be discussing the idea of capitalism versus communism in this time period. That was a very important part of this, was the idea of communism bad, capitalism good, or capitalism bad, communist good. You had two very different ideologies that were always at war with each other, warring at each other. And then the last thing we'll do is we'll go over a lesson quiz. It's just 5 questions. Answers are fairly simple. Everything we've covered in the lecture itself. And that's all I got. So see you guys tomorrow in class.